Hi, my name is Monica Gelman, and I'm a co-presenter of AZ Ed 101 today. We want to welcome you. To give you a little background about myself, I am currently a stay-at-home mom, but before children, I was a prosecutor with the Maricopa County Attorney's Office. I have three kids. Two are in the Tempe Union High School District, and one is in the Kyrene Elementary School District. And I kind of got involved with AZ Ed 101 shortly after the 2016 election, when I started getting pretty upset about things that were going on in education, and I had a lot of questions. And I found that there were other moms like me and other regular people who had questions, and the answers were out there, but they weren't in a very easy to digest format. So some people got together and formed AZ Ed 101, and we started going around and talking to all kinds of groups about education and funding and what it's like in Arizona.
Hi, my name is Sarah Richardson, and I, along with Monica, started looking for answers, and we kind of started this group in 2017. I'm a former 7th through 12th grade math teacher and a mom with 3 kids in the Kyrene School District, and grew up in Arizona, born and raised here, and a product of public schools. I currently am an adjunct professor for NAU, and I work for the Department of Ed, and so I'm really passionate about education and just really excited to share some nonpartisan factual information about education. We recorded this, pre-recorded this presentation, but we are signed on with you guys live, and we will be answering questions in the chat box as we go along. So if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. You can also go to our website, azed101.org, and it has our email, so you can always reach out to us to either present virtually to your school meeting or ask us some questions if you need more help. I'm going to go and share my screen, and we'll get started with this presentation. All right, Monica, can you see that? I just want to make sure it's working before I get started.
Yes, looks great.
Perfect. Okay, so again, we just talked about this. This is a grassroots effort. We've been all over the state of Arizona since 2017, talking to a bunch of different groups, school groups, parent groups, church groups, voting groups, any kind of thing you can think of. We're happy to come and talk to that and talk to the issues and answer questions. And if we don't know something, we're happy to look it up and point you in the right direction. We're not experts. We're just citizens like you who really care about education and want to make sure it's as great as it can be. If you don't already know this, the Arizona Constitution guarantees funding for education. If you look in Article 11, that's all the sections that deal with education funding. When Arizona was founded in 1912, they very much valued public education and wanted to make sure it was in our Constitution, and as kind of part of the federal government, it's not in the federal Constitution because it's kind of was understood to put it in their state constitution when they became part of the United States. So if you want to look this up, you can absolutely Google it. We're talking about 3 different sections of Article 11 today, just to kind of give you a background on what's actually required by law. Article 11, Section 1 talks about how the legislature shall enact laws that provide for the establishment and maintenance of a general public school system. Basically, what that means is the legislature by law has to establish and provide funding for our public schools, and they have to make sure they're as general and uniform as possible. So in a perfect world, we would not have schools that are really well-funded, brand new, and have all the bells and whistles, and other schools that are falling apart. They should be as general and uniform as possible, no matter where the school is in Arizona. Article 11, Section 6, I bring up either with parents with college kids or when we do this presentation at community colleges or at universities. Makes everyone shed a little tear, but talks about how university tuition shall be as nearly free as possible. So again, nearly free as possible is guaranteed in our Constitution. And if any of you have paid a tuition lately, you know that maybe that's not so true lately. Personally, my favorite Article 11, Section 10 talks about how the legislature shall make appropriations to be met by taxation to ensure the proper maintenance of our state educational institutions. So our legislature by law has to collect our tax dollars and use those tax dollars for public education, which some can argue probably hasn't been happening for quite a while here in Arizona. If you survey business leaders and taxpayers, education is one of the most important issues on their minds. Most taxpayers want to pay more money if they know it's going to go, that tax dollars are going to go to our public schools. And business leaders, when we do surveys for them as well, they talk about how a really quality public education system is really important for them to have business here in Arizona or to move a business here. Arizona's cut more funding than any other state in the entire nation since 2009. It's about $5 billion. And to no one's surprise, this causes a lot of issues. We have a teacher shortage crisis, aging school buses, and classrooms that are under-resourced. Now, this graph talks about the general fund. So when you hear people talk about the budget of Arizona, the general fund, this is kind of what that includes. It includes, the graph shows you all the different categories, and basically the main three big expenses are public education, health and human services, and public safety. And that's fairly similar for most state budgets, even the federal budget. Those are kind of the biggest expenses. And you can see how that breaks down here. If you go ahead and take a look, K-12 education gets a large majority of our state budget. It gets about 43%. So you'll hear about that a lot from politicians. They'll say, hey, what more do you want? You're getting almost half the entire state budget for K-12 education. How can you want more funding? Well, the problem for us is not the percentage of how much funding we get of our overall budget. The problem is our entire budget is too small for how many people live in Arizona. So we have a population of about 7 million people, and our budget, this is for fiscal year 2020, was about $12 billion. And if you just look at that, maybe it doesn't mean much until you kind of learn what other states are doing or what could be possible. So I'm going to show you a quick comparison with states that have really similar budgets to ours. So as you read through these numbers, you can see these 4 states we kind of just picked because they had as close of a budget to ours as possible, around 12 billion. You can see Maine as a little, almost 9 billion, and then Alaska up to about 14 billion. But something should jump out at you when you look at these numbers. You should see that the populations are much different than Arizona. So we have almost 7 million people. Wyoming has the closest budget to ours, and they have 585,000 people. So we're not just talking a few 100,000 less or even 1 million less than us. We're talking, almost a tenth of our population. So when we go ahead and look at, okay, well, what do states with similar populations? What do their budgets look like? You can go ahead and see we picked 3 states. Tennessee, Massachusetts, and Washington have budgets anywhere from about 16 billion to almost $30 billion. And they all have around 7 million people. Now, how each state collects money and how they collect revenue and what their budgets pay for vary. The budgets are fairly similar in that the top 3 expenses usually are education, health, human services, and public safety. But again, how the taxes are collected are different. So the way the taxes come in are different. However, we use this to show that it is possible for 7 million people to generate this much revenue. Now you might say, I don't want to be Massachusetts and pay $20,000 in property taxes. I really don't either. But again, 7 million people can pay taxes and business can pay taxes and we can generate more money. So there's room, I think, for Arizona, even if you compare it more to Tennessee and Washington, there's room for improvement that we could collect more money. And therefore each person, if you kind of divide this out, each person would get a bigger slice of the pie. We'd have more funding for our schools, for police, for healthcare, and it could really help the issues that we have. Now I talked to you about how each state collects revenue a little bit differently. And this is for fiscal year 2019, how Arizona collects taxes. So if you can see here, we get the majority of our taxes from a sales tax, about 45%. About 41%, 40% is our individual income taxes that we pay to the state. And then we have a small little section with some corporate income taxes and insurance tax. Property taxes are collected at the local city, county level, so it's not collected in our state revenue. It used to be in our state revenue formula. In the late 90s, they took that out, and so now that's collected more at a local level. Now there's kind of a big problem with this. So you can imagine if something happens, like a recession, that relying heavily on kind of one or two main sources of revenue, if something happens like a recession, it could take out one of those revenue sources really easily. So relying so heavily on sales tax is very volatile. It's hard to plan in the future for how much stuff people are going to buy. In a recession, people don't buy things. They stay home and save their money as much as possible. So you can see how very quickly that source of revenue can dry up, and that can cause trouble. And that's exactly what happened to Arizona during the Great Recession in 2009. Now this graph kind of shows different kinds of tax for the entire United States. So if you look here, this 0% is a US average for different tax collection sources. So if you think if this is the average, the red bars show the percent difference that Arizona is from that national average. You can look, we fall below the national average for every single type of tax collection except for sales tax. Sales tax, we're about 50% higher than the national average. We have the 11th highest sales tax in the entire nation. And a sales tax is problematic because it's a regressive tax, in addition to being harder to plan and budget. So if you could see here, this is how a sales tax works. So when I talk about being a regressive tax, this is kind of how we explain that. Which that means, a regressive tax means it negatively impacts low and middle income families rather than high income families. So this graph is showing you household incomes. We have the lowest 20% of families, that's a family of 4 making $16,000 or less. We have middle incomes kind of in the middle, and the top 1% are families making over $250,000 to $500,000 if you're a single filer or a family. And what the bar graphs show is for every $100 of income you make, how much that family pays in state and local taxes. So you can see that bottom 20%, the lowest income earners in Arizona, a family of 4 making $16,000 or less, for every $100 they make, they will pay $12.95 in state and local taxes. Whereas that high income family, the top 1%, for every $100 they make, they will only pay $5.91 in tax. So you're kind of saying, how does that work? You know, if I'm a high income family, I will probably pay more in dollars in taxes, which is true. So you might actually pay more dollars, but a proportion of your overall income is less. So I like to give this example to kind of help make sense of crazy tax policy. Let's say we have 2 families, and one family makes $1 million a year and one family makes $50,000 a year. Both families need to buy a new car. That car is going to be the same price, doesn't matter how much money you make. Let's say they both pick the same car, and just to make the numbers easy, let's say the car is $20,000. The sales tax is maybe $5,000. Again, just easy for numbers. So that $5,000 of sales tax is a much bigger portion of the family who only makes $50,000 a year than the $5,000 is for the family that makes $1 million a year. It's a bigger portion of their overall budget. And that's a really high level view of how a regressive tax works. So you can Google it or feel free to email us and ask more. But as you can see, it kind of negatively impacts. So when you hear people talking about raising taxes on the top 1% in Arizona, and why should we rely on them? Why should they have all the burden of funding education or funding our revenue in Arizona? As you can see right now, the burden of revenue collection is falling on low income families. There just was approved position that would increase income tax on the highest top 1%, and that's going to be on the ballot in November. So if you want to go ahead and look for that, I think it's Prop 408 is the number it was assigned, Invest in Education Act. And so you can look at that. This graph comes in handy because, again, what they're proposing is raising just that last bar to kind of maybe even out the playing field a little bit more. The low-income families will still be contributing more than their share, but you can do some research and decide if you want to vote yes to increase that tax or no to not increase that tax. So now we're going to talk about where education funds come from. So again, if you're thinking about that 43% of our budget, the way that's collected is very specific, and where the money comes from has kind of a very specific pattern. And if you ever want to look more about this, you can go look at the Department of Revenue. You can look at the JLBC. Those are online. You can Google those, and you can kind of learn about more how these are funded and how these funding formulas work. Right now, this bigger of the two graphs is how that 43% is made up. So we have the equalization formula, which I'll get to in a second, makes up the bulk of that funding, 69%. We get some money from federal funding and then a little bit from local funding and Prop 301 money. So that overall graph is how the 43% is made up. Now, what's this equalization formula? It's actually something Arizona does really well. Since 1980, we've had this equalization formula, and it states that no matter where a kid lives in Arizona, they will receive the same amount of per pupil funding. So in other states, education funding is done solely by property taxes. So if you live in a really wealthy area, you have a lot of property tax, which means your schools are really well funded. If you live in a low income area, you don't generate as much property taxes, so the schools are not as well funded. So in Arizona, in theory, no matter where a kid lives, that funding should be the same. It's not actually what ends up happening, and we'll get to that reason why in a minute, but on paper, it's a really good thing and something we should definitely be proud of. Now, how that actually ends up working is how what we'll talk about next. Think of pure per pupil funding as a little bucket. In Arizona, if you average it out, the average kid gets about $7,500, or the district gets $7,500 per child to fund them. And the way we do that is we first go to property taxes and we fill up that bucket with as much as we can. So in a high income area and a high property value area like Paradise Valley, for example, that might get filled up all the way or most of the way with property taxes. In a lower income area, maybe it only fills it up a little bit, and then what happens is the state general fund kicks in the rest of the money. So you can see the smaller graph shows you that most of the money does end up coming from the general fund, 57%. A little bit from property taxes, a little bit less, 38%, and then some from Prop 301 and the State Land Trust. So if this makes sense, the smaller of the two pie charts, that's what makes up the 69% of the equalization formula. That larger graph is what makes up the 43% of our overall state revenue. Now, real quick before we move on, I want to talk to you about this State Land Trust. You may have heard of it, you may have not. When Arizona became a state in 1912, the federal government set aside a big chunk of land and said, you can use this land to graze cattle on it. You can rent it out to farmers. You can sell little bits of it. We're going to put all that money into an account. You can never by law touch the principal balance of that account, but you can draw off the interest and help you fund schools every year. Keep that in mind because we're going to get back to the land trust and why that's important. Now again, we have an equalization formula. Every kid is supposed to receive the same per pupil funding, every district for each kid, but that doesn't end up happening. And there's lots of reasons. There's supplemental revenues that kind of make those buckets unequal. One of the main reasons in Arizona are because of bonds and overrides. So in other states, bonds are common. That's one-time voters approve who live in that district to increase their property taxes for a building or a bus, a big capital purchase. But something that's not done in other states are overrides. And that basically says you can ask the voters to vote an increase on their property taxes to go over their state allotted budget. And you can kind of see the breakdown on this slide. Now, if you put all these things together, bonds and overrides really disproportionately benefit wealthier districts. So it becomes very challenging for lower income areas and areas with not as high voter turnout to get these bonds and overrides approved. It costs a lot of money to put a bond and override on the ballot. It takes manpower to get signs printed and get the word out and teach voters about why we need these bonds and overrides. So they become kind of whoever can afford it and whoever has the manpower are the ones who get it passed. Luckily, most of Maricopa County and Pima County have had their bonds and overrides approved in the last several elections, but there are some districts who've been unable to. And sadly, because the state has underfunded our schools so much, these no longer pay for extras. These bonds and overrides are paying for things that really should be paid for by the state and have become, they pay for teachers, and they pay for art classes, and they pay for music. So things that really just aren't extras anymore. So when a district loses this funding or doesn't get it, they're forced to make some really tough decisions. If we really quickly compare per pupil funding to other states, Arizona, like I said, if you average it all together, which again, not every child receives this amount, but if you average it in Arizona, it's about $7,500. And you can see the top states are 3 times that much, all the way up to $22,000 per student. I tell a story because I gave this presentation to a group of high school students who are going to become teachers. And I showed this slide. I never thought of this before, but a student raises her hand and she looks at me and says, does this mean a kid in New York is worth 3 times as much as I'm worth? And that kind of broke my heart, because of course not, you know, no kid is worth more than another kid. But if you look at and could make the argument that a budget is a moral document, in Arizona, we have decided that this is how much each student is worth and how much we're willing to pay for those students. So imagine what we could do with 3 times the funding, the computer support, you know, the teacher salaries. We can have brand new textbooks, lots of nice buildings, great places for kids to learn. We could do a lot. And so it's something that definitely needs to be part of the conversation. Now, we talked about the fact that we don't have enough revenue in Arizona. Our pie is too small. You think of that budget as we each get a piece of the pie. The pie is too small for how many people live here in Arizona. Well, why is that? A main reason for that are corporate tax exemptions and corporate tax credits. Now, people use tax exemption as an umbrella term. Talks about any way that money should be going from a business or even a person to the government in the form of tax payments. And there's lots of programs that divert that revenue from the general fund. We're going to specifically talk about tax credits. We can do them as individuals, and businesses can do them as well. And it reduces the amount of taxes you owe on a dollar for dollar basis. It's money that should have gone from an individual or corporation into the general fund via state taxes, but it was blocked and sent somewhere else. So for example, you can give a tax credit to schools, you can give them to adoption agencies or animal shelters. There's lots of different places you can send that money instead of paying them to the government via taxes. Now that sounds great. You know, sometimes I'm not big judgment on where you put your tax credits, but it's something that money should have gone to the government, and then they have accountability and control over where that money goes. And so when you give a tax credit to an organization, you don't necessarily know how they're spending that money. It lacks accountability and control that it would have if you sent it to the state and then they funded those different organizations. And then I wonder too, we have so many tax credits in Arizona. Why do we keep adding more? Are they good? What's happening with the economy? And if you look at them, they're very good for short-term economic growth. So, you know, for now, like we're all staying home in a pandemic and losing jobs and not going out and shopping as much, or maybe taking pay cuts. A tax credit's really great in the short term to put money in people's hands so they can go buy things and kind of stimulate the economy. However, when you leave them on the books long-term, tax credits year after year, it stifles the way an economy can grow. It's just unable to grow. So you think of each tax credit as maybe a finger around your neck, and eventually you're choking. You're unable to let the economy expand, and you run out of steam. In Arizona, 73% of corporations paid the minimum state tax of only $50. And no, that was not a mistake. Most corporations in Arizona pay only $50 in state taxes. And I don't know about you, but I personally pay a lot more than $50 a year to the state of Arizona via my taxes. Most corporations pay less, you know, $5,000, only 10% pay $5,000 or more. We have the 6th lowest corporate tax rate in the entire nation. And these tax credits are the reason why we don't have more money in the general fund and how these corporations are able to pay such a low amount. We also have something called carry forward. So let's say I contributed $10,000 in tax credits, but I only owed $5,000 in taxes at the end of the year. State of Arizona lets you keep that extra $5,000 and you can use it anywhere from 5 to 15 years from now. So it's kind of a debt that the state of Arizona owes back to you at some point. And if you add that all up right now, it's over $1 billion. So at any point, that money could be claimed and the state would lose $1 billion and have to pay it back to taxpayers or corporations. We talk a lot about small businesses. We're a very business-friendly state, and we like to claim that. And by and large, again, there are small businesses that can absolutely take advantage of tax credits, but by and large, our large corporations right now have that favorable tax policy. So most of our small businesses in Arizona pay more in income taxes than the large corporations do. Our tax policy disproportionately benefits large corporations and harms small businesses. And we can see these numbers here show you that we're talking about doing what's best for Arizona and growing our economy. Local businesses, restaurants, and retailers return more of their profits and more of their revenue to the local economy than these big box stores or chain restaurants. And you can see that a local retailer will return 52% of their revenue to local economy, and a local restaurant gives almost 80% of their local economy that revenue. So it's definitely something to think about when we're talking about tax policy. Who's benefiting and how could we make it sure it helps our economy? Now, there are a lot of different corporate tax credits available and private tax credits for taxpayer individuals like ourselves. We're giving one example of this. So this is a corporate tax credit, something only corporations can use, that they can give to private schools. So we told you at the beginning of this presentation where our tax dollars are supposed to go, and it's guaranteed in our Constitution, they go to public schools. Think about that as we talk about this corporate tax credit, which is money that should have gone to our general fund, tax dollars, but instead is going to private schools. This specific program, if you add it up, since 2007 has even a little less, even more than this now, but has $1 billion. So that $1 billion should have gone to the state general fund, but instead went to private schools in Arizona. And again, we don't make judgments about private school versus public school versus charter school, but when we talk about what's promised in the Constitution of Arizona is that our tax dollars go to public schools, and it does not say to give that money to private schools. We talk about where is this money. So in 1980, when I was just almost born, we had 5 different types of tax exemptions, and now we have over 331. We give away more money than we actually bring into the general fund. So when you hear politicians say we have a balanced budget and we are, very fiscally responsible and fiscally, conservative state, that's not exactly true, because we give away more money than we bring in. We give away $14.7 billion every single year in tax exemptions. And as you can see in our general fund, we bring in about $12 billion a year. And for fiscal year 21, it's around $13 billion, but we're still giving away more money than we're bringing in. And I don't know about you, but if I spent more money each year than I made, I'd be bankrupt and homeless and no one would care. We also do not have a balanced budget. We don't have that. It's a special accounting term that we have that ensures that you can use these tax credits in one certain way, but they're not included in the budget. So you can have your balanced budget is anything that includes a year after year expense, but a tax credit's a 1-year expense. So what that means is that we don't have to include that in our budget. So when we say this $14.7 billion, we have that kind of gets pushed to the side. And it's just a funny accounting trick. Other states do it as well. It's not just Arizona, but that's why you don't have to include it in the budget every year. They're kind of separate accounting categories. Now I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Monica, and she's going to give you the rest of the news. It's not always that bad, so hopefully you take a deep breath and everything will be a little bit better.
Yes, and Sarah is going to keep switching slides for me, so if there's a little lag, just bear with us. The other thing I wanted to point out is if you look at the lower right-hand corner of every slide, you can see the sources. We didn't do the collecting of data ourselves. It had already been collected, and we simply collated it. So we tried to use non-partisan sources, and they are all there at the bottom for you to check. Okay, so the question is, has funding always been this bad? And no, actually, public education in Arizona was really funded pretty well all the way through half of the 90s, and it didn't matter whether the Republicans or the Democrats were the majority party. In fact, in 1960, we ranked 19th in per pupil spending. This is usually the part where I stop and clap because it's nice to be in the top half of anything in Arizona when it comes to education, even if it was 40 years ago. But unfortunately, there has been a systematic and some would argue intentional disinvestment in education and an overall revenue decline in Arizona for over a decade. And the next slide says, okay, so how did we get here? This is kind of a quick timeline. I'm just going to go through it very fast. There are slides that will follow to go into detail. In 1995, Arizona passed the most expansive charter school law in the country at the time, as well as open enrollment and site-based decision-making. And as most of you probably know, open enrollment means that if there is space available at a school and you can provide transportation, your child can attend any public district or public charter school in Arizona. Site-based decision-making is to allow individual districts some determination of how they're going to spend their money. It has pros and cons, and we can get into a little bit of that later. In 1997, the very first private school tuition tax credit began for private schools. That's kind of what Sarah talked about. Tuition organizations are the mechanism that administer those private school tax credits. In 2000, we passed Prop 301, which was to provide a designated source of funding for our schools. In 2006 was the first time that they attempted to pass a school voucher law, and it was ruled unconstitutional in 2009, basically because it provided a direct means for state funds to be provided to religious schools. So in 2011, they came back at the voucher idea. This time they called them empowerment scholarship accounts. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but they are, many would say they are vouchers simply in another name. In 2016, they passed Prop 123. That was the governor's big plan to help funding in Arizona and try to take care of the cuts. We'll talk about how that didn't really help very much. In 2017, they passed a massive voucher ESA expansion, but in 2018, a voter initiative was brought and the voucher expansion was actually voted down. So at this point, we are back to the original empowerment scholarship account law from 2011. According to the US Census, Arizona has cut K-12 education more than any other state in the country. And we were already ranked pretty much at the bottom in education before the Great Recession. From the fiscal year 1993 to 2016, Arizona has lost $2.3 billion with a B per year, or if you adjust it for inflation, it's almost $5 billion a year in revenue that we have lost. The biggest funding cuts were to things like full-day kindergarten. If you are in a district that provides full-day kindergarten, that is because they have found money in their own budgets, oftentimes through things like bonds or overrides, because the state only funds half-day kindergarten. Capital funding was cut. Those are the things that build new schools and take care of major repairs. And the building renewal form, the legislature only funds 20% of what the law requires for building new schools, major repairs. The total cut is about $250 million, and that's not accounting for inflation. There have been major cuts in university funding. 10 years ago, the state funded about 75% of the cost to educate a resident in one of our in-state universities. Current funding is only at about 34%. Unfortunately, tuition has increased just exponentially, 244% over the last 2 decades. Arizona is one of the only states in the country that does not have a tuition assistance program for students, and that makes it harder for the universities to provide that financial aid and be accessible to residents, as well as retain quality Arizona students to stay in our universities. Many courses have been dropped over the past 10 years. Arizona is, about 5 or 8% behind their peer universities for teacher salaries. And again, attracting those good professors who will come in, who will bring research to the university, who will provide quality education to our students is key. And universities have difficulty doing that if they can't pay what other universities would pay that same professor. The regions have worked really hard to keep that, but like we said, it's really difficult when the legislature has just slashed university funding year after year after year. If you look at additional cuts to university and community college funding, you can see just by this column, we were doing okay from about 2009 to 2015. Since 2015, our community colleges have not gotten any of the state dollars. And as you probably know, our community colleges are a robust system that helps a lot of people, whether it be a stepping stone to going on to a university or to where they're going to get their associate's degree. Next slide says, so how did we get here, Prop 301? So in 2000, the voters approved Prop 301, which was a dedicated funding source and demanded that education funding keep pace with inflation. And what it did was it increased the state sales tax by just 0.6%, changing the state's rate from 5% to 5.6% for state sales tax. It directed about $800 million of dollars to new school improvement bonds to help correct the existing deficiencies. And that additional 0.6% was to go to teacher salaries, performance pay, school site funds. But unfortunately, when the Great Recession hit, the legislature just stopped paying that money. They appropriated it to other line items in the budget. And so in 2010, the Arizona Education Association and ASBA, the Arizona School Board Association, filed suit to force the legislature to comply with 301. Unfortunately, the legislature pushed it all the way through the court system. They said, we're not going to pay that. And eventually, the school groups were victorious all the way up to the state Supreme Court that said, yes, the legislature is violating the law. It needed to fund this. But unfortunately, the legislators said, make us. You know, I see you have this court decision, but we're still not going to give you the money. Now, specifically, Prop 301 was about to expire, and so during the 2018 legislative session, they did vote to extend that 0.6% sales tax. Unfortunately, in doing that, it is no longer a voter mandate. It's not protected by the Voter Protection Act, and that means that funding is under legislative control, and if the state gets into a bad place, they can take it away through a simple majority vote of the legislature. As I said, there was the lawsuit and that it was taking a lot of time. As I said before, I started with AZ Ed 101 before I had kids. I was an attorney, and I will tell you that any lawsuit is time consuming and is costly. And so at some point, the school group said, we won, but the legislature is fighting us. We're just going to have to keep going into more and more legal battles. This is expensive, and schools are starving. The schools were starving for money. And so Governor Ducey got together with some education groups and came up with Prop 123 as a compromise to settle all of these lawsuits. And what Prop 123 did was it changed the distribution rate from that state land trust that Sarah was explaining to you, that special land that was held so that we could have education funding from there. Previous to 123, we were only using the interest to fund some things in schools. But Prop 123 changed that distribution rate, and it actually like cracked open the trust and started taking from the principal. So Prop 123 took the school's own money to pay the schools back. This is the saddest slide, in my opinion, because Prop 123 was still not enough. If you look at the silo or the graph on the left, you see all the things that have been cut over the past decade or so, since 2009. full-day kindergarten, textbooks, inflation, all those things. If you look over on the graph to the right and you look at that small purple rectangle down near the bottom, that's Prop 123. And there's a little bitty blue thing above that, which was additional about $50 million. All of the red is the money that is still missing, the K-12 cuts that are over $1 billion. And like I said, the schools were forced to accept payment from their own account. So they had to pay themselves, and they still did not have enough money to make up for all of those cuts. In fact, because the distribution rate was changed, it's estimated that over the next 40 years that the State Land Trust will lose $8 billion. Okay, so we talked a little bit, and I'll go through these kind of fast, the alphabet soup of diverting public funds to private schools, STOs and ESAs. So through STOs, that's the Student Tuition Organization, those private school tax credits, they're vouchers by another name. They are money that is headed towards the state general fund, but diverted off to an organization that will give it to private citizens. High-income taxpayers are the typical beneficiaries of these programs, not only in their participation, in that they are able to donate those tax credit monies and be without that money until tax time when it serves as a credit on their income tax. But also, it's found that really the majority of the recipients are middle to upper income, the students that are awarded these. Not a large percent goes to true students who are experiencing financial hardship. Like we said, about 30% of the scholarships are given to families who are making more than $80,000 a year. About 40% go to families making less than $42,000 a year. So those are tax credits. ESA, like we said, was created in 2011, and it was started to be a very small program. It was started in the beginning to only benefit students with disabilities and special needs, students who would have an IEP or a 504 and could not have their needs met by their public district or charter school. To receive an ESA, well, I'll go back really fast. The legislature has slowly expanded it and expanded it and expanded it. So now it includes things like students of active duty military, students who live on the reservation, students who were in foster care. My personal favorite is siblings of any qualifying category. And I always give this personal anecdote. My youngest son has autism. He does attend public school, but he does have an IEP and would qualify for an ESA. I have two older daughters. They are typical learners, but I could get an ESA for them as well to send them to a private school simply because my son has a disability, even though my daughters are typical learners and having their needs met in their public school. To get that ESA, you have to waive your right to a public education. You have to waive a lot of federal and state educational protections. And the way that they give the money in an ESA is it's similar to a checking account, and they do distributions. I think they're monthly now. They used to be quarterly, and the Department of Education is trying to put more oversight on the program because there were some problems with fraud. But basically, parents are given something that's like a debit card. Money is put into an account, and then they can use it for educational purposes, obviously for private school tuition. They can homeschool them with private tutors. They can purchase educational materials. A couple things they can't purchase. They cannot purchase any technology. They cannot purchase any school supplies, and they cannot use it for transportation at all. So if you have a student who is a low-income student and somehow gets an ESA and can go to a special private school, but it's across town, they can use that ESA to pay for the tuition, but they can't pay for a bus pass or gas or Uber or a taxi to get that student to the private school. ESAs take money directly from the general fund. They are a line item in the budget, unlike the school tax credits, which are diverted revenue. Next. Okay, so a lot of these things are not going to come as a surprise to you. When you inadequately fund schools for over a decade, you have a lot of problems. Biggest one, large class sizes. Every teacher I talk to, when I say, what is the biggest obstacle to doing your job, they tell me large class sizes. Arizona is currently 49th in the United States in per pupil funding and has the second highest class sizes in the country. The student to counselor ratio is awful. It's the highest in the nation, with 924 students to only one school counselor. And research shows, surprising nobody, that smaller class sizes, especially in those primary grades, K through 3, can boost student academic achievement. They recommend that there are no more than 18 students per teacher in grades K through 3. You may want to pause and laugh here. My children never had a class that had 18 students or fewer when they were in K through 3. I don't think they've ever had a class that small in their entire career. Additionally, minority and low income students show even greater gains when they are placed in those smaller classes in the lower grades. Low teacher pay. This should not come as a surprise to you either. As of 2018, Arizona was 49th in the United States in teacher pay, even after the 20 by 2020 plan. Governor Ducey likes to argue that maybe we're only about 41st in the nation. And I said, well, that's still in the bottom 20%. That's an F. There is strong evidence that highly qualified teachers result in higher student achievement, and that salaries drive the ability and quality of those highly qualified teachers. If you look over here at the different states, an Arizona teacher can move to any neighboring state and get a raise as a teacher. If you look at Arizona, again, it shows we're at 49th, where the average teacher salary is about $44,500. Teacher shortages come because the conditions are not good. In 2018, about 46,000 students were without a teacher, and a total of 135,000 students were without a certified teacher. Tons and tons of positions were filled by long-term subs, emergency certification, and by the end of the school year, there were almost 1,600 positions that were unfilled. Another problem we have is that about a quarter of our teachers could retire very soon. Those are the teachers that serve as mentors to new teachers. They have the institutional knowledge. They are highly qualified and expert teachers, and we really will suffer when a large amount of them retire. We talk a lot about the fact that there is not really a teacher shortage in Arizona. In fact, there are about 90,000 certified teachers here in Arizona. So we don't lack for teachers. What we lack is for teachers who are willing to teach in the conditions of our Arizona public schools. All right. Building maintenance and operations, another problem when we have underfunded schools for all these years. There's another lawsuit going on right now. In 2017, a lawsuit was filed that has to do with the building maintenance funds and soft capital needs. Those are things like technology. If your students are virtual right now, they are dealing with technology, and those areas have not been properly funded for years. And so there is a lawsuit about that, because they started cutting that, the legislators started cutting that soft capital and building maintenance. Back in 2009, they blamed the Great Recession. Unfortunately, even after economic recovery, and Arizona really started doing better. In fact, all the other states did better. Other states started replenishing those funds, and Arizona just kept cutting, no matter what. As Sarah said, school districts are left to pass bonds to pay for infrastructure costs. And that ends up with Arizona citizens paying for things that really the state revenue should have paid for, and that creates a disparity between districts in higher income areas and those in lower. And I'll give you an anecdote. My own child's elementary school district just voted this week to install HEPA filters and to really do kind of an overhaul of their HVAC system to try to help the spread of COVID. They're able to do that because of bond money. Places that don't have bond money, I don't know what they're going to do if they want to improve their HVAC system. Like we talked, they started cutting in 2009, and since then the cuts have topped $2 million. Right now for capital expenses, school districts are supposed to be funded. This is a requirement by law. Supposed to be funded at $450 per elementary student and $490 per high school student. And those amounts have been static since the 1980s. But as of now, schools are only getting between $40 to $80 per student, depending on the district. So that those building and maintenance funds are significantly underfunded and actually violating the law. Shifting really fast, oftentimes someone will come to me and say, Monica, did you know that charters are public schools? Yes, charters are public schools. There are some differences. Charter schools are contractors that receive taxpayer dollars to operate and manage those schools. They're privately controlled. Charter school materials and equipment are usually privately owned, and they are leased to the school at the taxpayer expense. Charter schools have self-appointed boards that are not necessarily accountable to the community. Districts have publicly elected governing board members. In fact, charter schools can have boards that only have one person on them, even if that's the person who owns the charter school. District schools have to share their information publicly, and charter schools do as well, but not to the same extent. About 2 sessions ago in the legislature, there was a bill to try to require charter schools to have the same reporting requirements and transparency requirements as district schools, and that bill was shot down. Charter schools don't have to provide transportation. They statistically serve fewer students with disabilities and English language learners. They cannot, by law, turn away any student for those reasons, though sometimes you hear of schools counseling out students who may be more difficult to educate due to their disability. New district schools are only built when they're needed. Charter schools can pop up whenever and wherever a charter school operator wants to, and you will often see charter schools popping up in close proximity to very popular or successful district schools. So for district schools, their first funding source is going to be those local property tax collections. Like Sarah said, we have our per student funding. They're going to fill it up with whatever they can do with property taxes, top it off with those state taxes from the revenue or from the general fund. Additional revenue for those district schools can come through bonds and overrides, and they have a really small tax credit program. They can get up to $400 if you're filing jointly, but it's very specific. District schools can only use the tax credit for a small amount. Charter schools, they cannot pass bonds and overrides, and because they don't have any geographic boundaries or anything like that, so they don't have property taxes to really pull from. Charter schools, so they get the majority of their funding really from the state's general fund, and they can receive those same tax credits that the public schools can. I am going to pause for just 1 second on this. Revenue for private schools and homeschooling. So the primary source of private school revenue is, of course, tuition that is paid by the individual. Private schools can also receive STO, that tax credit money, or ESA, but they cannot receive both from that same student. So a school can get it from both sources, but a student can only have a tax credit scholarship or an ESA. Private schools, like we said, they get money from the corporate tax credits. It took over $100 million from the state budget in 2013. There are 4 different private school tax credits, 2 for individuals, 2 for corporations, and you cannot direct your own tax credit to your own child at a private school, but you can ask family and friends to donate on your behalf. You can have a party over and invite all your friends and tell them to bring their checkbook and send it in. And while the private school does not have to give the tax credit scholarship to your child, it usually works out that they will. Homeschooling is under the jurisdiction of each county. If you want to homeschool, all you have to do is fill out a paper with your county school superintendent saying, I want to homeschool. And like I said before, homeschools, families can use ESA money. And in addition, law requires that public schools allow homeschool children who live within their boundaries to try out for interscholastic activities, participate in elective classes at district schools. They can charge those homeschool families money, but they cannot refuse to admit their child to those programs, assuming that there's space. So what do you have in a public school? And when we're talking about this, typically we're talking about public district schools. You're going to be guaranteed a certified teacher. The law doesn't require that anymore, but the districts, every district that I know of still requires certified teachers. You're going to have fingerprint clearance and background checks. Private schools don't all require that. You'll have protection under both state and federal law, things like FERPA, things that cover students with disabilities, IDEA, all those are protections for public school students. Private school students do not have those protections. Public schools have to follow the Arizona and the state constitution. They serve all students, special education, gifted students, English language learners. Public schools have to identify and evaluate students with special needs. In fact, if you are a student at a private school and you feel that you need to be evaluated for possible special education, the public school where you would be enrolled has to provide the evaluation at their own expense. Public schools are subject to the Freedom of Information Act. They have to report their outcomes publicly, and there are schools in all areas. You will find in rural areas far fewer private and charter schools. So what can you do? We get to the end. If you feel, before I tell you what you can do, I tell the story that the first time I gave this presentation to my husband, I said, "How do you feel?" He said, "I'm overwhelmed and I'm mad." And I said, "Oh, good, then I've done my job." So if you're feeling overwhelmed or mad or confused, those are normal. And like we said, we are available right now in the chat to answer your questions. But other things you can do, attend the PTA meetings. I don't have to tell you guys that. Support your local school. Attend those school board meetings. Attend your legislative district meeting. If you don't know what legislative district you're in, we can help you find that out. Contact your local senators and representatives and the governor. And I really recommend you reaching out to your local legislators. I've written many emails to Governor Ducey, and I have called before, and I've never spoken or gotten a response from Governor Ducey, but I have had one-on-one discussions with each of my state legislators. The other thing you can do is investigate candidates' campaign funding. Look at who really supports public schools. They're all going to say they support public schools. To say you don't is to say I like to kick kittens. But look at who's funding them, and if the organizations that are funding them have a history of supporting public schools. If it's an incumbent, look at their voting record. There are a lot of agencies that will produce almost an education scorecard, and you can see, are these people doing more than paying lip service to supporting public schools? And with that information, take it to the ballot box in November and vote for officials who are actually going to commit to funding our public schools. I'm going to turn it back over to Sarah to close us out. You are still muted.
You'd think by now, 6 months into this pandemic, we'd remember to unmute ourselves, but here we go. So thanks, Monica. Thank you guys for sticking with us. I know a lot of information. Have a lot of information on our website, az101.org. You can email us, and the email is on our website. You can ask us in the chat. We just want to know, it's really important for you to stay informed about what's happening. Teachers and parents kind of often say, I don't want to get political. Everything in education is political, from funding to hiring decisions to everything that's happening decided by people who are elected. So it is political. It does not need to be partisan. Democrats, independents, Republicans all support public education. And we come together and agree that that's, something that our democracy was founded on. It's a very important principle. So we definitely want to make sure we have that support. And it's important for you to vote down ballot in every single election. The president and our state senators who go off to Washington, they don't have anything to do with public education specifically here. So you want to know who the governor is and your local representatives and your school board members. they're the ones making those decisions that affect you and your kids and the teachers every single day. So again, lots of resources to make that and nonpartisan and just the facts. And we'd love to thank you guys. Appreciate it. Have a great conference, and hopefully next year we'll get to see you in person.
Thank you. Stay safe, everyone.